You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 44, Chrome Heart. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. Well, what makes a mechanic tick? To find out what goes on behind the showroom floor, behind the service desk, and behind the doors at the back of every shop, I went to the most famous motorcycle mechanic I know. And what began as a tribute to the people who keep our motorcycles running ended up as a story about someone who helps keep the love of motorcycles burning. And it turns out that sometimes, at least, those are the same job. We'll meet her in a moment, but first, this. With Movember's most important month now behind us, I want to say thank you to the listeners who stepped up and gave to the Movember Foundation this year in the name of this podcast. It really means a lot to me, and if you'd like to join them, you can look for the mustache in my show notes and give what you can. November may be over, but the scorecard stays live until the end of December. I also want to acknowledge some of the recent reviews you've been giving This Motorcycle Life on Apple Podcasts in particular. I mention Apple only because that's the platform that pushes these to me. I know that these ratings and reviews help people find this podcast, and that's great. But I have to be honest. For me, the size of this audience pales in significance compared to how these reviews help keep me focused and motivated. People seem to really get what I'm trying to do with this. I can't tell you how important this is to any podcaster, staring at their microphone and wondering if they're talking to themselves. The time you put into these reviews really counts. And with that, why don't we get started? Among my various deficiencies as a motorcyclist is the embarrassing fact that I do very little of my own maintenance. It's not so bad that I don't know how to keep my bike safe. I'm very diligent about that. I also think I have a pretty respectable knowledge base about this stuff, and I do observe a strict maintenance schedule for all my bikes. But I also have a gift for turning a $100 funny noise into a $1,000 trailer ride. It's kind of reached the point where even a 50-50 chance of sidelining my bike with a poorly turned wrench is enough to keep that wrench safely tucked away in my tool chest. I might just be the only rider I know who's never lost a 10 mil socket, and so I've become a loyal customer to my local shop. And that's probably the reason why on my long list of possibly interesting episode ideas, I've always been curious about the life of mechanics. Mechanics as a breed, but also as a window into who we are as riders. Surely these folks have stories to tell, and surely they're often unsung heroes in the lives of riders. Well, that's just the kind of topic this podcast loves. The only catch is, as a breed, and maybe almost by definition, mechanics aren't exactly extroverts. So, as episode ideas go, this one's always been a bit of an orphan. And then, a couple of months back, I got an email from a listener that said, simply, "You should interview Miss Emma." Cue the forehead slap. He was right. I should. Well, if you listen to Motorcycles and Misfits, one of my favorite motorcycle podcasts, then Miss Emma Booton needs no introduction at all. But if you don't, well, she kind of defies one. Miss Emma is a fixture in the motorcycle scene of California's Bay Area, a highly sought-after builder and restorer of custom and vintage motorcycles. By all accounts, a supernaturally talented mechanic and a passionate historian and mentor. And on top of all that, she's one of the most ardent advocates for this community and for the love of motorcycles that you might ever meet. Her big-hearted presence amidst the anarchy of the misfits seemed to promise that she'd make a great guest. I was pretty sure I'd learn something, and as is so often the case, I got even more than I bargained for, as you'll shortly hear. Now, technically, this interview is going to sound a little different than what you're used to, because my guest slot, we should be able to see each other while we talk. Well, she was right. It was fun, despite the crack about my shirt, and I'm going to try to do more of this. My only regret was that it meant there were times that you couldn't hear her laughing, which you really should. I caught up with Emma Booton after a long day in her shop in Marina, California. Well, hello, Miss Emma. I am so excited to meet you. How are you doing today?
I am fantastic, Bruce. Happy Thanksgiving, by the way.
And to you. And to you. I mean, neither of us are native to the country that's celebrating it right now, but I think we can join in the fun.
Well, any holiday that is centered around eating is okay with me.
Yes. Yeah, ditto. Especially staring down the barrel of a long winter. The idea of turkey sounds pretty good right now. Well, look, as I said a second ago, I'm a huge fan. So are a number of listeners to this podcast, which is kind of how I got my nerve up to reach out to you, actually. So I want to say thanks for joining me again. And I do have a sense of how busy you are. So I consider this a special favor, and I'll owe you one for whatever that's worth.
Oh, please. Honestly, Bruce, it's my pleasure to do this. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm hugely busy with the shop. The Misfits always keep me busy. But it's such a thrill. I still get a kick out of people actually being interested in what I have to say. So, no, the pleasure's all mine, believe me.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Well, I'm going to actually ask you about the Misfits and about that enthusiasm you have a little bit later on. So I'm glad you brought it up. So I have to confess, I mean, this episode is kind of a tribute to the people who keep our motorcycles working. And you're probably the most famous mechanic I know, if that's not too much of a reduction. But I'm also interested in you, if that's okay. So I thought maybe we could start off by spending a bit of time getting to know Miss Emma a little bit. And if you don't mind, I want to try to separate your story as a rider from your story as someone who works on and builds motorcycles, because I think they're kind of parallel tracks. Or maybe you can correct me if that turns out not to be true. So why don't we start out with your life as a rider? So I have a feeling from listening to you on Motorcycles and Misfits that you've got something more than the ordinary story to tell between growing up in 1960s and 70s England and ending up as a custom bike builder in California. I feel like I'm talking to a witness to history, if that's not impertinent. Look at you. I'm trying to I'm trying to be flattering and charming, and I think it's working. So anyway, can you sketch that out for us? Can you tell us a bit about that journey as a rider?
So flattery gets you everywhere with me, Bruce. But to talk briefly about my story, I mean, it's very much a story in two halves. And it's a story of learning my craft in England, where it rains all the time. And then, of course, California. And I've spent let me think. Hold on a minute. I have spent far longer riding in California than in England. We're not talking about mechanics now. We're just talking about riding.
Right.
However, I started off in the mid-70s in England. And, back then you could start riding at 16 years old on a very, very small bike. Most of us wanted to get involved in 250s as soon as possible. And back then it was all about two strokes. So my first, without getting involved too much in the nonsense I rode around on, my first proper bike was a Kawasaki 250 triple, an S1C. It's 3-cylinder, 2-stroke, no power whatsoever, but it sounded epic. And this love of riding two strokes on the street is something that's really stayed with me all my motorcycling life. And of course, it's getting harder and harder, especially in California. But this love of two strokes, but of course, it was a way of life for me. So I started off on the Kawasaki. I moved on to a Suzuki triple quite quickly, which was a GT 550 Then I got my first water buffalo, my first GT 750, and that would have been in late 78. And kind of graduated up from there. I've spent a lot of time on large Suzukis. My first super bike was a Suzuki GS 1000.
Wow.
And then I very, very quickly got a GS 1100 because that was everything that the GS 1000 wasn't. And British bikes. I have always, either as a standalone bike or as a supplement to a Japanese bike, I've always had British bikes. I mean, back in England in the 70s, they were cheap. And there's always, and you've heard me talk about this on the podcast, there's always a certain reverence for the domestic product. And we should always hold the domestic product in reverence. And here in America, I like Harleys, no matter what Liza says. And secretly, Liza enjoys Harleys. But as far as I go, there's this reverence and respect for the local product. So my ownership and ridership of British bikes, it's kind of BSA 250 Barracuda, BSA A10 Road Rocket, BSA Royal Star, Norton Commando, Triumph Bonneville, of course, everyone had a Bonneville, Triumph Trident, Triton, which was the mix of the Triumph engine in the Norton Commando frame. I had a brief stint with a Ducati GT 750, which was just a lovely, lovely bike, but the most appalling electrics I have ever encountered. Once made the mistake of taking the headlight off, and all this multicolored wet spaghetti just spilled all over the front fender. And I just kind of stuffed it all back in again, said, I'm never going to do that again. But England's got a very, very interesting climate. And I like to think it's a good place to learn your craft. The roads are very small. The traffic is very crowded, but it's fast moving. And the weather is bad most of the time. If you occasionally get a sunny day in England, I mean, it's glorious. But back then, rain and understanding how to ride quickly in the rain was very much part and parcel of motorcycling. And so that's how I learned to be very, very smooth. And I like to think I'm not a particularly fast rider, but I'm a very smooth rider. I don't jerk around a lot. The entry and exit into a corner is very, very smooth. Braking's very smooth. I like to lay the power on smoothly, even if I'm messing about with 160 odd horsepower.
It's interesting. I'm going to ask you about British bike culture in a little while. But the observation about the weather is actually quite interesting, because I just today, by coincidence, I happened to be watching a video on YouTube of a guy who at 72 had to kind of hang up his helmet, and he had come back from some very serious health problems, and what had motivated him to keep riding was to keep healing rather, was the possibility that he might be able to ride again, which he did for a few years. So at any rate, the video is of his final track day before he stopped riding, and he turned in at 7:30 at the Nürburgring on a Panigale V4, and there's onboard video of the whole lap, and it is stunningly perfect. And it just got me wondering, like, what is it about British? I mean, I appreciate there are Italian, there's lots of great riders from other countries, but there was just something about this guy who was a plumber by trade, not landed gentry, and just this supreme. Anyway, I'm digressing terribly here, but I love that observation about the rain. Before we move on from your origins, I think I read somewhere that you might have been a bit of trouble when you were a young rider. I think I read something about a bar bed involving riding to Germany and back. You don't need to go into that if you don't want, but would you cop to that? Or are you a reformed reprobate?
Oh, there's nothing reformed about it. I mean, given half the opportunity to be speeding and behaving extremely badly on a motorcycle, I mean, I'm there front and center. I will stick my hand up in the air and say guilty as charged, even at 60 years old. My behavior on a motorcycle is appalling. I'd like to talk a little bit about the style, because there is an English style to riding a motorcycle, and it's very different to the American one and very different to the Italian one. And we can go into that trip to Germany. Our heroes, certainly as I was growing up, Surtees, who was a champion of both Formula One and motorcycling. Mike Hailwood, of course. Barry Sheen. Where would the world be without Barry Sheen? But all of these riders have the very, very same thing in common. And you can throw the Phil Reeds into the mix. It's very, very neat. You're very compact with the bike. Your knees are gripping the tank and you're tucked. The American riders, they're very, very flamboyant, knee out, hanging off. And that's a very effective way of getting around a corner. But the English style is very, very neat. You're really tucked in as part of the bike. And that's how I ride. That's how I'm sure our 72-year-old retired plumber rode.
I'll send you the video.
You can go quite quickly doing that.
Yeah.
It's the best way I can describe it is it's a compact style. But that particular trip that you're referring to, it was very, very early on in my ownership of my GS 1100. And I realized, I was lucky enough that at 18 years old, I had this thing that had 112 horsepower, and that was a great deal of horsepower at the end of the 70s. And I realized this thing could happily cruise at 100, 105 miles an hour with no effort whatsoever. So we thought we'd put it to the test. And I lived in Birmingham, which is right in the middle of England. And it's a very gritty industrial city, but actually in real terms, it's a great location because everywhere's either close by or equal distance away, depending on your point of view. It's the same to go to London as it is to go to Scotland. It's the same to go to the East Coast as the West Coast. So everywhere's not particularly far away. And so we decided there was a particular club in southern Germany that we wanted to visit. So we worked on me. It was me and a friend who had, I think he had a KZ 1300. And we both were, Friday was a working day for us. So we finished work at 5 o'clock. And then the step number one was to get from the central part of England down to the south coast so we could take a ferry. And the last ferry was at 10 o'clock. So we had about 4 or 5 hours to get down to the south coast. And we got jammed up in London. So from London to Dover, which I can't remember the distance, I think it was about 100 miles. We actually did it in 50 minutes at night, just so we could make the ferry. And they were literally closing the barriers, and we just went scorching through and just made it onto the ferry. And then, of course, we got 2 or 3 hours sleep on the ferry boat. And then off we go again down to southern Germany. And we arrived quite early on Saturday and had a brief nap and put our tents up. And then partied all Saturday night and got ourselves in an appalling state. And then woke up with very, very poorly heads on Sunday morning and started heading back to England. And we got back to the ferry boat. I think we got the last ferry, which was 9 o'clock out of France, back to England. And then I actually got back home, I think at, I want to say probably 4 a.m. on Monday morning, and had about 3 hours sleep and then went to work on Monday.
Oh, to be young.
Big weekend. I'd love to have that kind of energy now.
Yeah. Well, I think you said that trip wouldn't even be possible now in that time.
I don't think so. Yeah. There was the traffic now and the policing now. I mean, England, I believe, is a nation of speed cameras. And unless you do something to disable the license plate on your bike, but I don't think even that would work because all these things are enforced now. I really don't think you could do that trip now.
Yeah, yeah.
So one for the ball.
Yep. Well, it kind of, I thought it was fun to sort of mess around a little bit in this, this thing about British bike culture, because I think it informs your story a little bit. But I also kind of wonder, I also think it informs the passions of a lot of people for riding. I mean, as I sit here at my desk, I can see a picture of a Norton Commando, and over there is a picture of a Triton. And I've never ridden a motorcycle in England. And, there's no legitimate reason why I should claim those passions, and yet I do. So I wondered if you had a thought about what makes British bike culture different and why it seems so universally important to people.
I like to think that, whether it's true or not, I like to think that perhaps Britain was the birthplace of biker culture of sorts. And I'll expand that because right now we're going to have a lot of people who ride Harley Davidsons going, what the hell is this blasted woman talking about? But I'll expand on that. From day one in England, motorcycling has been seen as a very working class pursuit and a legitimate means of transport. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment in the Americas it's not, but it's always been far more of a leisure and a racing pursuit. And so whether that really gives any legitimacy to it, but my group of friends, none of us had cars until our 20s. So all through our teen years and early 20s, our only method of transportation was a motorcycle, in good weather or bad. All our money was spent on motorcycle. We all lived in very, very straitened circumstances because any spare money we had went on the bike. And there's certain cultures that came up through England that are unique to England that have kind of been adopted in later years, like the cafe racer culture.
Yeah.
It's completely English. And cafe racer culture really couldn't have existed anywhere outside England because you needed a certain period in time, which was the 1960s. You needed a certain youth culture that wasn't allowed in pubs just yet because they were too young. So they couldn't go into pubs and bars. You needed an infrastructure of not freeways, but major roads to get you from A to B with cafes and restaurants, predominantly for the truck drivers. And that's where the culture was born from. So these young guys who predated me by a few years, and I'll come to that in a minute, they would frequent these cafes and bars, these cafes and restaurants, drinking very strong coffee or tea and eating truck driver food because they couldn't go into pubs. And besides, if you're riding a powerful machine, the last thing you want to do is get drunk. And then the whole culture would come on. All of these places had a jukebox. You'd put on the latest song, and then you had to get from a predetermined point, which was usually outside the cafe, to an island maybe, or around about a couple of miles away and back before the record finished.
Right.
And that was so prevalent in the 1960s. Now, I came along in the mid-70s, and a lot of those guys were still around. Now, us, we looked very different to them. We all had very, very long hair, and we liked bright clothes, and our bikes were bright, and the style was a lot more flamboyant as the 70s were. But those guys who were riding in the 60s, they were a little older by now. They were in their 30s. They're still riding British bikes, almost always black, a little bit scruffy, and they were a little bit scruffy. They had short hair, Italian wraparound sunglasses, and they were mean. And they had their own pubs. And I figured out very, very early on, I wanted to be them. I found I resonated far more with them than with the hooligans riding around on, Yamahas and Kawasaki's like I had.
Right.
Hence, I always had British bikes around, even if I had Japanese bikes. I usually had 2 or 3 bikes on the go at a time. But the one that had all the money on it, lavished on it, and all the polishing and all my attention was always the British bike.
Yeah. I am guilty of the same thing. Although I will say in defense of Harley riders that if I'm on my Triumph, I will always get a wave and occasionally a cup of coffee bought. There seems to be some grudging affinity between those two brands. So, just in defense of the big cruiser guys. I wonder, just as an aside, something I've always been curious about, and I didn't have a tidy place to fit it into this conversation. How along the way did you become such a historian of this stuff and of bikes?
Well, I've always had quite a peculiar brain, Bruce, because I've always had the kind of brain that I will see something, and rather than take it on face value, I'll think, what's that all about then? And so really all these bikes that I was growing up with, rather than just say, oh, that's a nice Norton Commando, it's like, what do I need to know about Norton Commandos? And so I'd find out about them just incidentally. And then it all gets stuffed back into the recesses of my brain. And, I've just been around for so long. I'm a living link between the 1970s and right now. And over the years, just these little bits of information have been kind of thrown at me and they've kind of stuck. And here I am, I'm a historian. Mm. And, Liza, it's funny, like I keep on referring to Liza, of course. And I'm sure some of your listeners will know who Liza is, the head misfit somewhere. But she sent me a picture yesterday trying to stump me. And of course I knew exactly what the bike was because but it wasn't something I went out of my way to become. I mean, we never feel that we're going to become, old guys. We never think we're going to become little old ladies. We never think we're going to become the matriarch or the patriarch of our family. Mm. And yet, by default, here we are, because life moves on.
Yeah.
I can close my eyes, and being 21 was yesterday, but it's nearly 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So, that's one of the peculiarities of life.
Yeah, it is. Although I have to say, I don't think all of us remember the intervening years as clearly as you seem to, at least when it comes to motorcycles. And maybe that's a good bridge to the next chapter. So, which is kind of how you ended up, with a wrench in your hand, so to speak. I'm curious to know how early in the game that interest presented itself. And then I'm guessing that you didn't kind of, dutifully graduate from motorcycle mechanic school and dutifully go and seek a career in repairing and building motorcycles. I have a feeling it's more complicated than that, but maybe not. You can tell me. How did that journey unfold?
Really out of necessity, because I come from a very, very working class family. As a lot of bikers did. And money was kind of tight. We all had friends who had money. I vividly remember a very, very dear friend, a young guy called Ben Billings, who showed up one day on the most gorgeous 750 SS Ducati, brand new. And this would have been 77. And I think it was the most beautiful thing I ever saw in my life. But he had financial clout. I didn't. So if I wanted a bike, I either bought a very, very feeble type of bike, which didn't appeal to me at all, or I bought something that was a little bit better, but in slightly more downtrodden condition that needed a little bit of help to bring it up. And so I learned very, very quickly how to fix them. I learned very, very quickly that I could make money fixing my friend's bike, because we go back to this peculiar brain of mine. It's like, how does combustion work? How does carburation work? And back in those days, bikes were very, very simple. Even the super bikes were simple. A Suzuki GS1000, it gives you out of the box 88 horsepower. And the porting in the cylinder head, it's, got about as much air resistance as the inside of Grandma's purse. So it's really easy to actually get it flowing a little bit better. And you can turn 88 horsepower into 100 horsepower without too much effort. And now you've got the fastest bike. And people are like, hang on, Emma's got the fastest bike. How did that happen? And then, I want the fastest bike. Can I pay you? Sure. Because I've never been secretive with information. If I've got information, I want to share it with everybody.
Clearly.
And the industry is full of people. It's, I've got a secret and I'm not going to tell you because that gives me the power. I'm not one of those people. If I know how to make a bike go fast, I'm going to shout it from the rooftops. It's getting harder now. I mean, bikes are getting to the stage, you've pretty much got everything when you buy them at the factory now.
Right.
But yeah, there's still a few tweaks here and there. And I started off the way a lot of people did. I started hanging around the local bike shop and making a complete nuisance of myself. And on Saturdays, occasionally, I wanted to fix a couple of bikes. And the owner of the shop realized I was actually a far better mechanic than the guy he was paying. So I got my first job. And then I got noticed by the local Honda rep. And he suggested I go and work for Honda, which I did. And I kind of moved up the ranks in Honda. And I worked for Triumph for a little while as well, actually at the factory. Because once you've got this passion, and once you get a little well-known in the industry, and you get this name for yourself, you get kind of tossed around a little bit. And it's fine. I mean, my loyalty has always been to motorcycles in general, rather than any particular brand.
Right.
It's funny, I work for Triumph and I work for Honda. If you ask me what the great love of my life is, it's always big air-cooled Suzukis. Just this visceral love of big, burly air-cooled Suzukis. I think they're just the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah, I can see that from the smile on your face. It's funny how like animals these machines are sometimes. It strikes me, the way that you explain that, it strikes me, and this is a hard question for anybody to answer about themselves, that this emerges first as a talent, that not as a kind of a learned skill, that it's something you have to, or at least in your case, had a knack for. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. I think we as motorcyclists have a very different relationship with our vehicles than people who drive cars. So we'll take the average, and I hate describing anybody as average because, I mean, people who love cars run the gamut. But let's just take the average motorist. What the average motorist wants from his or her car, they want to go out in the morning, turn the key, they want the car to start, and they want them to take them safely and comfortably to work, to the shops, to pick up the children, and back. Job done. Now, we have a slightly different relationship with our vehicles to that, and you kind of nailed it. a motorcycle really, in a lot of terms, is the closest thing to a living animal beneath you. Believe me, it can kill you very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason we love them so much. It's like sitting on a rabid dog and just chaining all this power and harnessing it and taming it. And if you want to work on them, you can go to MMI and they will teach you the mechanics of working on a bike, the ABC. But that's only half the picture. You really need to get a feel for both the bike and the person and make sure you kind of match them up and make sure you give the person the safest and the best product for them.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm going to ask you about exactly that in a few minutes. I'm encouraged that I haven't found myself in a blind alley. So I guess if I were to ask you if you believe in mechanical sympathy, you would say, yes, that's a thing.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I'm going to make it very, very clear. A lot of people ask me if motorcycles have character, and they don't. Of course they don't, because they're made out of metal and rubber and plastic, and they're completely inanimate objects until you complete the picture. But hang on, because every single person rides their bike differently. When you introduce the human element into anything, it changes all the parameters. So if you spend enough time with a bike, you brake in a certain way, you use the clutch in a certain way, you shift gears in a certain way. And every time you operate those controls, you're putting the most microscopic wear on each of the items. Because it's you, you wear them in a very specific way. And so your bike becomes completely unique. It takes quite a while for it to happen. You're talking many thousands of miles. But you can have, if you take two identical bikes that roll down the production line, let's go back in time, and Bruce and Emma both buy brand new Suzuki GS1000s in 1978. And you get VIN number 000571, and I get VIN number 000572. And we both ride our bikes for 10,000 miles. Yours is going to ride very differently to mine, even though they went down the line together. Mm-hmm. Because you've worn it in a very exact way that's unique to you. I've worn mine in a very unique way to me. Can you extrapolate that means that we've given the bikes character? Perhaps. I like to think so.
Yeah, me too. I'm solidly a romantic about that stuff. And it should be noted, just as an aside, that you're the second English woman this year to say to me a motorcycle is incomplete without a rider. So maybe there's something to that British bike culture thing we were talking about earlier. I heard you say once recently that if you were forced to choose, forced being the key word here, because obviously the choice would be too awful. If you were forced to choose between riding and wrenching, you would choose wrenching. And I hope I'm not using that term. I don't mean it to sound dismissive, because it's anything but that. I'm curious to know a little more about that. Why, if you were forced to make that choice, would you choose to continue laying your hands on bikes rather than ride them?
Oh, that's very, very simple. And don't worry about the term wrenching. If you ask me what I am, a lot of mechanics will say, oh, I'm a suspension expert, I'm an engine builder, I'm a wheel and tire expert. I'm a humble wrench. And I have been for 43 years. And that's how I describe myself. It says so on my business card. Miss Emma, wrench. I like to think I'm a fairly selfless person. And if I was to continue wrenching, I can affect hundreds of motorcycling lives for the good. If I give that up and just ride, I think that would be quite selfish on my part, because then I'd just be affecting myself.
That is not the answer I expected. That's so interesting, because I thought that it might be a more pragmatic response, in which case I was then going to ask you, do you think that that's typical of people who work on motorcycles professionally? But I don't feel like we could generalize that way about what you just said.
Yeah, I don't know. As you figured out, I'm quite a unique individual.
Yeah.
Gosh. I know a lot of mechanics who actually don't ride. Certainly don't ride on the street. So, but whether that is the case or not, I really don't know. I like to think I'm a far better mechanic than I am a rider. We all like to be good at something. Actually, it's not a choice I have to make. Didn't say it'd be an easy decision.
No, indeed.
But I think if we talk about mechanics and who's left in the industry right now, who's actually earning their living repairing bikes, I like to think that most of the old guard who are left are doing it with some degree of passion, because it's a hard life. I mean, you're pushing 600, 700-pound bikes on and off your ramp. You're lifting engines out. It's a very physically demanding job. And even when you own your own motorcycle shop like I do, the pay isn't great. You have some absolutely fantastic months. And then you fall into this trap and you say, my God, if every month is like this, I'm going to have a yacht and a Bentley by the end of 2022.
Yeah.
But the reality is, the next month, all the chickens come home to roost, and all the problem children are sitting there like little ducklings waiting for you to work on them, and you're not earning a penny. So you have to look at the big picture, and it's a nice living. I live in a reasonable house, and I have nice things around me. I certainly wouldn't classify myself as wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I'm solid working class stock, darling. Solid working class stock.
That's right.
I've got a colour TV and a flush toilet and everything.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the breed. I think the unofficial slogan of Canada is "Who do you think you are?" So I think you are, in fact. Yeah, I had a feeling that would be familiar to you. I'm curious to know, who is the best mechanic you ever knew?
Mechanics are an interesting breed. Because every single one is quirky. Every single one has their own kind of specialty. And you have to define what makes a mechanic good. Mechanical excellence, engineering excellence, speed of being able to get the product out quickly. I would have to say, I've always been a fan of making big horsepower engines. And one of my heroes is a guy called Stan Stevens. And Stan Stevens, who is still in business, makes Funnily enough, Suzuki two-strokes go very, very fast. And he just completely understands multi-cylinder two-strokes and what makes them tick. And I think to be able to focus in on a single thing and just become so good at it. I'm a master of nothing. I'm good at a lot of things. So if you bring me a Harley, I can fix it. If you bring me an NSU, I can fix it. If you bring me a Triumph or a Suzuki or a BMW, I can fix it. But I'm a master of nothing.
And
whereas anybody who's just so good at a certain thing, they earn my admiration.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you might be being modest. I've heard you diagnose problems, by email that seem to me exotic and obscure. But we'll leave that there. So you gave me the impression earlier, and this is the impression I've had of you just from listening to you on the Misfits, that you are as interested in the people who own the bikes as you are in the bikes themselves. And I wondered if maybe that said more about you than it said about the job. But I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit more about the role that empathy plays in this work.
Oh, it plays everything. And let's get back to actually how a motorcycle gets down the road, and again, compared to a car.
Sure.
If you look at a car with dark windows, you can't tell whether there's a person who's in there or not. And that's how much effect you have on that vehicle. Yes, it's not going to move without you, but you're kind of swallowed up by it. Now, let's think about a motorcycle and think about the design of a motorcycle. The design is not complete without the rider on it. I've seen some unspeakably ugly bikes. And then you put the rider on, you're like, oh, hang on. I know what they were thinking. A great example, which may be a bike that's familiar to you, is a John Player Norton. And a John Player Norton was one very, very early attempt at a factory replica racer. It was basically a completely standard Norton Commando with a very, very nice fairing, tank unit, seat unit in red, white, and blue. Very, very handsome bike with a very peculiar looking seat. And you think, what were they thinking? But then, of course, you see one with the rider on, you're like, that's what they were thinking.
Right.
The design becomes complete. And so it is. It's an analogy for how riders and owners play into fixing these things. I've always approached it in a very holistic way. I like chatting with the owner. What are your expectations for this bike? How do you ride? What do you want it to do? What do you want it not to do? Empathy is absolutely everything because we're all so different. And what might be the greatest thing since sliced bread to one rider might be the kiss of death to another. I recently, I'll give you a perfect example and a real world example. I recently had a gentleman contact me. I've worked on his bike for years, and I'm not going to name him, but he's got one of the big old Aprilia Capenauds.
Right.
Giant. And a Generation 1, big old thing. It's like a truck. And he's quite a young guy, and he had a stroke a couple of years ago.
Oh, dear.
Well, he's recovered, but not completely. And he contacted me about a couple of months ago, and he said, hey, I'm getting well enough to ride my bike again. That's great. So the bike arrived, and he arrived, and I spent a little time visiting with him and just very discreetly figuring out what his mobility was. And I didn't want to make a big fuss because I didn't want to embarrass him, but I was very observant of his range of movement, and I gave him a cup of coffee so I could observe his grip. And I kind of figured out that his grip wasn't fantastic, and his range of movement was not quite as much as it used to be. So when I repaired his bike, I put a slightly lower handlebar on it, and I put a dogleg clutch lever on it. Without saying this is what I did, I just said, I've modified your bike, which I feel is going to be a lot better for you, without drawing the attention to, oh, you've had a stroke, and so now your life's going to be different. And it worked out very, very well for him because the dogleg clutch lever just brought it closer to the bar, so he didn't have to reach quite as far. Mm-hmm. And the slightly lower handlebar meant his range of movement. He was now, rather than at the upper end of the range of movement for him, we now put the handlebar right in the middle of his range of movement. So it just made it a little easier for him without drawing attention to it.
Right.
Because, you've had a stroke. You're in your damn 30s and you've had a stroke. He's probably quite upset about the whole thing.
No doubt. Honestly, that sounds amazing. My mind goes to the mechanics who spend their lives in the back of the house and never see a customer, and there's a service writer in between them and the person who's brought their bike in. Should I feel sorry for those guys, or is that a different sort of breed in your mind?
I think it is a different sort of breed, and we're not going to throw them under the bus because in order to repair a motorcycle and repair a motorcycle effectively, you don't need any social skills whatsoever.
Right.
You may have all the social graces of Bigfoot and perhaps look like him as well. But if you can fix a motorcycle diligently, carefully, and get it back to the customer, that's perfect. But that's not what I do. But then Mototown is a single woman shop. I take the phone call, I visit with a customer, I work on the bike, I give it back to the customer. That side of it it's not available to everybody in the industry. And the fact of the matter is if you go into a dealership, you're going to be dealing with a service writer, and a good service writer will kind of figure out all these things. There are some great service writers out there, some absolute stinkers. But as a customer, it is up to you to convey as much information to the service writer as possible. In an ideal world, a service writer is almost like an interpreter. He's going to take customer speak and interpret it into mechanic speak. So if we go back to our friend at a dealership experience, if we went to the Aprilia dealership, hey, I've had a stroke. My range of movement isn't great. Well, the service writer says to the mechanic, put a dogleg clutch lever on it.
Right.
Whether that would happen or not, I don't know. I'd like to think so.
Yeah. I think that's pretty variable. I have had, maybe negative's too strong a word, but I've had experiences at dealerships that were disappointing in that regard. The people that I see now, if something big is being done to my bike, the boss will actually bring me to the back of the shop, insurance be damned. I always had this feeling that he does it so that the mechanic and I can look each other in the eye. But I appreciate it. And based on what you're saying to me, that's probably not common and is, and is pretty special.
That is actually a great boss. Back when I worked at the last big dealership I worked at, I was constantly in friction with the service manager. But the actual sales manager loved me, because if somebody bought a brand new bike, my shtick was always, I'd have it set up on my ramp. And when they were ready to take possession of the bike, I'd walk them into the workshop, and obviously there'd be very, very visible, no entry to the public, chains across. And I'd move the chains, bring them into the workshop, put the chains back behind them, and I would go over every inch of their bike on my ramp before they took possession of it, and just had a little question and answer with them, made them feel very, very special, like it was a big occasion, because it was. And I think a lot of people lose sight of that. To the dealership, it's just another bike going out. But to that person, that may be the first new bike they've ever been able to afford. That might be the first new bike they will ever afford.
Yeah, yeah.
So we need to make them feel special. We need to always consider the person.
Well, it's certainly what keeps them coming
and
back.
I don't want to. Well, yes, and I don't want to sound like Mary Poppins, and have this very, very naive point of view. I mean, I've sort of carved out that reputation for myself now in the industry, I feel. But we need to kind of get back to understanding that we're not doing the customer a huge favor by working on their bike. They are doing us a huge favor and a huge honor by bringing their bike to me. And I'll treat them that way. It's a very, very different mindset.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and a mindset that I think it must be hard right now when bikes are just walking off the floor of their own volition, but it sure sounds like good advice to me. You have often talked about how a motorcycle sort of reaches the point in its life when it becomes more the product of its owner than the product of its maker, if that's a fair summary. And I wonder if when a bike comes into your shop, if you sort of look for that story, are you profiling me if I bring a bike to you?
Oh God, yeah. I'm judging you 100%. If you bring me a bag of bones, dry chain hanging on the swing arm, no tire pressures, no brake pads, who is this guy? No, bikes change dramatically. Any motorcycle is a high maintenance vehicle. Even the simplest motorcycles need their valve clearances done regularly, need their chains just adjusted and lubricated regularly, need their tire pressures checked weekly. And it's very, very easy to fall behind. If you come to me as a new customer and chains dry, tire pressures are very, very low, I'm more than likely to say, hey, listen, this is how you lube your chain. This is what you should be looking for. And get into the habit. When you fill up your bike, check your tires. The most safety-minded motorcyclists are always the one who make habits for themselves. Fill up the tank time, check your tire pressure time. You've listened to me on the podcast. I used to drive heavy buses.
Yep.
You can't take a commercial vehicle out of a yard without doing a pre-trip, every trip. And really, that should apply to motorcycling as well. How long does it take just to make sure you've got coolant in the system? How long does it take to just make sure you've got oil in the window? You don't even need to put a tire pressure gauge on the tire. Just kick the tire with the heel of your boot. Does it feel solid? off we go. Just a brief pre-trip. So rotating back to your question, if a bike comes in that's very, very poorly maintained, I'm more likely as not just to do, a little bit of gentle education with the rider. And if they're just completely not interested in doing it, I'll say, well, listen, let's set you up with a regular maintenance schedule that's affordable for you so that you don't have to worry about these things. Come down, see me. I'll always put air in your tires and check the pressures for nothing. But let's set up, monthly chain adjust, biannually oil change, and just keep the maintenance going so you don't kick the can down the road. Because, deferred maintenance will get you in the end.
Yeah.
You can kick that can down the road only a certain amount of time, and sooner or later it's over.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, that's advice that kind of stands on its own, even notwithstanding this conversation. But I've always wondered, maybe it's just an excess of self-consciousness, but there was years ago in another life, I read a quote by a Polish cavalry officer who said, "Show me your horse and I'll show you who you are." And I often wonder when I drop a bike off, what it is, if anything, about my bike that's giving me away to the guy who's going to work on it. Because in this case, it's a guy. What are the tells that I'm not aware of that might determine, how he feels about the person who's going to ride this thing?
You'd be surprised. Not many mechanics are going to be judgy like that. But I would really, really like to give you and your listeners little advice when you drop your bike off for work. And it's two very, very simple things. If you are dropping your bike off for any service, please clean it. Even if it's just rudimentary, just run a hose over it. Dirty bikes are not fun. But the second, you'd be surprised how many people drop their bike off for a major service, a valve clearance service, and, I'm just going to fill up the tank on the way. Now, yes, I'm a feeble 60-year-old woman, but I'm a very, very strong one. But manhandling 6 gallons of fuel off a fuel rail while trying to pop off a fuel injection connection on the bottom, it's tough. Drop your bike off with an empty tank.
Interesting.
I don't mean you don't need to be on fumes, but if you're going in for spark plug service, valve clearance service, fuel filter service, anything that involves pulling the tank off, and you might not know that. So if in doubt, just bring it in with half a gallon of fuel in it. And I guarantee you the mechanic will think you're just great.
It's that easy. That's great.
It's that easy. Because believe me, if you drop a dirty bike off with an absolutely full to the brim fuel tank, the mechanic will hate you complete.
It just makes so much sense when you say it. That's funny. And also really good advice. I'm wondering why you're such an advocate for people being able to do their own maintenance. I have the sense that you are. Maybe that's just the persona that you bring to the Misfits, but I have the sense that that's something you believe in. There are probably people in the world who would find it odd that you would, spend your spare time teaching people to do for themselves the thing you do for a living. And so I wonder what philosophy reconciles those two things, being a mechanic and encouraging people to be independent of mechanics, or do you think I've mischaracterized that?
Oh, no. Yeah, I've always been a huge advocate for people working on bikes. In this soap opera of motorcycling, there's room for everyone. And teaching people to work on their bikes and being an advocate for people working on their bikes has generated far more work for me than you could possibly imagine. Because if I teach somebody how to change the oil on their bike and lubricate their chain, it's very, very fundamental tasks. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be confident about changing a tire or doing valve clearances or setting up throttle bodies. They might not have the equipment to set up throttle bodies. You know, I've got $1,000 worth of shims at the workshop.
Right.
Who can afford that? So my philosophy has been, I'm happy to teach people how to do whatever they feel comfortable with. If they're comfortable building an engine, more power to them. But the reality is, most people are comfortable doing basic maintenance chores. And that's fine, because I'm not jamming up my workshop with simple tasks. People are keeping themselves safe. They're being more engaged with their motorcycle. They're bonding with their motorcycle more. And when it's time to do something a little more ambitious, who are they going to call? Me.
Right. Yep, that makes sense. It makes sense, but I have to tell you, I a lot of times when I'm listening to conversations about that subject, I find myself getting a bit red with embarrassment because, so I'm going to confess something here before all my thousands of loyal listeners. I don't even do my own oil changes. I know how to do lots of stuff, but I also have a gift for turning a $100 job into a $1,000 job. And so I'm I'm a loyal customer of my mechanic. And so I wonder if you think that's a moral failing. Do I need to do better, or am I just part of a different group of people in your mind?
Far from it. There is room for everyone. And rolling around on the floor with a 17mm wrench, you know, dodging hot exhaust pipes, getting red hot engine oil all the way up to your elbow, busting your knuckles on center stand brackets, it's not for everyone. I am not going to judge you in the slightest. I'm far more likely to judge you for that very fashionable plaid shirt you're wearing rather than any failing about oil changing. You know, it's not for everyone. Motorcycling is not for everyone. Motorcycle maintenance, even the most rudimentary tasks, is not for everyone. My brother's a perfect example. You know, my brother has been in academia all his life, and I poisoned his mind with motorcycles as soon as I was able, much to my mother's chagrin. And so, like me, he's been messing around with motorcycles all his life. But he's always been in a position that, yes, I know how to do them, but by the time I've taken time off work, by the time I've rolled around on the garage floor and done it, it makes far more sense for me to pay somebody else because this is what I earn. And that's his excuse. Now he's retired and he's got more time. He's doing a little more himself. But I never judge anybody, Bruce. Whether they build the finest engines in the world or they're not even comfortable checking their tire pressures.
Right. Yeah, I'm not that
because
bad.
There's room for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's an important message. I mean, the safety stuff that you talked about earlier, I mean, that is important, and I'm actually quite diligent about that. But you're talking to a man who managed to twist the head off a shock bolt, reinstalling it, and then did it again. So You understand my dilemma. I see the look of
Right.
horror on your face. Well, good. I'm glad we had that conversation. This is. I think I'm going to ask you a question in a minute that maybe I won't preempt myself. Let's move on to the next thing instead. You talked a little bit about winning over the affections of service writers and mechanics, and I was going to ask you specifically about that. If you had to kind of write a manual, for the care and feeding of your shop and the people who work there, what advice would you give us about how to be a ray of sunshine when you walk through the door?
No, so I want to make sure it's clear. So are we pretending that you are my staff and I'm writing a memo, or are we pretending that you are my customers and you want to make life easy for me as you're walking through?
Your customers.
Just be kind. It's kindness and patience are a wonderful thing, because remember, as a customer, you have to realize the mechanics speak a very, very different language to you. If you pick up a factory workshop manual for your bike, it's a different language completely.
Yeah.
It is the language that mechanics speak, and speak fluently. And so if I was writing a workshop manual on the perfect customer, number one, they'd speak clearly, because a lot of mechanics I know are deaf because we've spent so long in noisy workshops. So speak slowly and clearly, but speak very concisely about what the problem is. And the thing is, we don't need you to say, oh, it's the chain, it's this, it's this. What we need to do is say, what I'm upset about with my bike is I have a very nasty vibration. Where is it? It's in my feet. Left foot or right foot? It's my left foot. I'm feeling a vibration through my left foot that wasn't there. And narrow it down. Does the vibration get more the faster you go, or more when you rev the engine up? Well, it's more when I rev the engine up. So we've got a loose engine mount. Conversely, does the vibration get more when you go faster? Yes, it gets more when you go faster. So we're going to focus in on the drivetrain. So be as specific as you can. Give as much information as you can. You don't need to diagnose your bike. You need to be clear about what you're unhappy about.
Right.
And if it's running great, hey, this thing runs great. I'm just here for routine maintenance. The thing I want to make clear as a mechanic, and funnily enough, I've had this conversation quite a few times lately because I work on older bikes. And I just want to remind people, if you bring your bike in for routine maintenance, I just want a service. What a service will do, it'll bring everything back to factory specifications. What a service won't do is cure a fault with a bike. So what do I mean by that? So if you've got an old BMW, an old air-cooled BMW, what we call airheads, cylinder heads are sticking out either side, and they're right in your line of earshot. If you've got loose valve guides, they're going to produce noise. Meanwhile, as the valves wear, they recede into the cylinder head, so the valve clearances get tight. They don't get big, they get tight, which can take away some of the noise. So you bring in your BMW airhead for a service, and me, being the diligent mechanic, set the valve clearances back to factory specs. And guess what? Now it's a lot more clattery than when it left. and you're waving around, waving your arms above your head and getting red, and it didn't make a noise like that when you dropped it off. Well, of course it didn't. But this is why. So a lot more clarity of what your expectations are and what you want from the bike. Generally, if you've got a Japanese bike with 30,000 miles on it, with a reasonably regular service schedule, it's not going to have significant enough wear that a service is going to cause you problems. Once you start getting into the 50 and the 60,000 miles, there may be additional problems, some of which may be addressed by a service. Some of it may require additional work. If your bike's burning oil, changing the oil, unless the oil is really disgusting, isn't going to cure the oil burning problem. Generally, if you fire your bike up and you get that puff of blue smoke, I can put the best oil in the world in it, and it's not going to cure that. The horse is gone. You can close the gate all you want. So it's understanding that. The real cure for your bike there is a top-end job, maybe valve guides, maybe piston rings. We need to stop the oil getting into the combustion chamber. And that's not going to be addressed by routine maintenance. That's something more. So just some clarity of that. Motorcycles are like us. We get old. If I'd have known my body was going to be this shambling wreck at 60, I'd have taken better care of myself when I was in my 20s.
I hear you. Yeah. So it sounds to me like if I come in and say, so my bike is making this noise, and I went on a forum and here's what I think it is, that's not going to win your affection.
The internet is an interesting place. Back when I started out, back in the 1970s, we got most of our information from workshop manuals, and we got most of our information from books. And if you wanted to print a book, you either needed to be quite an expert on the subject and convince a publisher to actually publish your work, or you needed to have a certain amount of financial clout, which gives you, I guess, some credibility, whether you deserve it or not, because you're rich. These days, with the advent of the internet, everyone gets a voice. And that can be great, but you have to become something of an expert in navigating what's complete rubbish and what's valuable information. Occasionally, I have actually dipped into the forums to figure out what people are thinking about a certain problem. I've got a Honda 450 on the ramp right now. It's a CRF 450, very, very high performance single cylinder bike. And these bikes are notorious for the valves recede into the head, and then the valve clearance runs out. So even the thinnest shim won't cut it because you have no valve clearances. What are people doing? What are people doing in this case? Are they shaving down the bucket? Are they shaving down the valve? Are they building up the cylinder head and putting new seats in? So occasionally we'll go into a forum like that. But generally, if somebody comes in and said, oh, I read this on a forum and blah, 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 I'll smile and yes, very nice. And my eyes roll back to my head and like, very good. Okay. And just evaluate the bike on its own. There's value to forums.
Yeah.
But they can also be a minefield because once you get people who are that into an exact product, like a KLR 650, if you want entertainment, go onto any KLR 650 forum. Those guys are passionate.
I have that impression. The word doohickey comes to mind. Well, that's more generous than I might be. But it sounds like a fair assessment. I'm The other thing I wonder, and this is going to seem like a very trivial question, and we can move on to grander themes, but I have a KTM, which I take to a KTM dealer to be serviced, and I love those guys, and they do a wonderful job. I tell myself that one of the things I'm getting for that is that if there's something amiss, they see these bikes all day long, they'll notice. Do you think that's a delusional, or do you think that's true?
Oh no, I think that is absolutely true. I mean, KTM dealers are a perfect example. They're a lot easier bikes to earn your money doing. KTMs, Aprilias, to a certain extent BMWs, Moto Guzzi's, all these quirky European manufacturers are not the easiest bikes to work on. So when you take your bike to a specialist dealer, if you're riding a Super Duke, they've seen 100 Super Dukes just like yours. And if there's anything peculiar that's coming down the pipeline, they will have seen it. So, no, I agree with you completely.
Well, that's very comforting. I've been listening to the Misfits for, I don't know, maybe 6 years or more. And so you become invested in the characters. And I was quite excited for you when I heard that you were opening your own shop, Mototown. And the sense I had at the time that you first shared that with everybody was that this was going to be kind of you were going to do it your way moment, that this was in effect kind of the ultimate chapter in your career as a mechanic and a builder. I doubt that will turn out to be true, but that's certainly how it felt to me anyway. So as I say, I inferred from that Motortown was going to be about doing it your own way, and I'm wondering, is that true? And if it is, what does that mean?
Well, we're 9 months in now. I exhibited my Turbo Wing at the One Show at the beginning of May. And I actually opened the doors of Mototown the day I came back.
Wow.
Or should I say the following day. So I came back from Portland on Sunday and Mototown opened on Monday. So that would have been May the 6th. So here we are, June, July, August, September, 7 months in. And my vision of Mototown has stayed exactly the same. There is no other bike shop like it. There used to be. But I think as a concept, I'm trying to stay as true to my original vision as possible, because I want it to be, first and foremost, it's a workshop. This is how I earn my living, working on bikes. But to me, the value in having my own business is not making so much money that I can rival the Aga Khan. It is earning sufficient money that I can pay the bills, and then having sufficient time left over to visit with my customers, to maybe do some education, to do some ridiculous things like the Numb Nuts Challenge, right, which I don't know whether you've heard of it yet. Yes.
I have.
And do all the fun things and have time for the fun things and not be so bound to generating money that I can't stop and smell the roses and have fun. So that, to me, is the value of having my own business.
Right.
And I don't think for a big dealership or even somebody who had employees, I don't think that's sustainable. I'm very lucky where I am. I got very reasonable rent. I got a very understanding landlord. I have a superb location. And I'm deliberately trying to keep my costs as low as possible, so that low costs means I can balance the books very early in the month, and then it's playtime. Then it's build my bikes time, visit with people time, whole classes time. I've got all these grand visions for Motortown. I'd love to get together with some local artists and have them say, look, this is your wall. So for the next couple of months, let's display some of your works on this wall. If we can sell one or two, that's money in your pocket. And do things like that. But it's an evolving process.
Right. Yeah, it sounds amazing. You mentioned earlier, you said something like there isn't another shop like it, but there used to be, and I wonder if you want to talk a bit about the change that you've seen. I had a conversation with someone a couple of episodes ago about the sort of the drift from art towards science that seems to have happened in our relationship with these machines. And he took the view that, it's all good. The old bikes are still there if that's what we wanted, but the new bikes are cool too. And he was very sort of equanimous about it. But people have strong feelings about whether the past was better than the future or vice versa. And I wonder what you think about that, especially given the choice you've made here to model the shop on something more, more traditional, if I can use that word. Are we better off or not?
Gosh. Oh, that's such a loaded question, Bruce. I mean, when we get nostalgic and we look back, the sun always shone. The riding was always great. The people were always great. We had the best times. The music was better and blah, 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 blah. And the truth is, it wasn't always like that. But I had a very, very good time growing up on motorcycles. And I feel that I occupied a very specific time in England. And I saw some really pivotal things come and go. See, when I started in the mid-70s, the rockers were still riding. Right. We talked about that. They looked different to us, and they were a different breed, but they were still out there. And I used to go into a lot of the shops. There was one shop I used to go to in downtown Birmingham called Vale Onslow. And Len Vale Onslow was just this iconic old guy in motorcycling. Back in the 1930s, he'd had his own brand of motorcycle.
Wow.
And you'd go into Onslow's shop, and it was very dusty and quite dirty, and there'd be this ugly one-eyed cat lying on the counter, and you'd have to pet the cat, and there'd just this smell of oil and old British motorcycles. And there were parts, and you had to deal with a guy wearing a brown coat who knew everything about everything. And you'd say what you'd want, and you'd fiddle around in the back and come out with a part. And it was just, you knew that it was very much of the past. But then you go into a bright modern dealership, and there'd be all these gloriously colored superbikes lined up underneath neon, and it was very modern and very forward thinking. And the two worlds were living together, but you knew one was going and the other one was coming in. And then we go forward a few more years to when the race replicas first came out. When the first Gixxers came out, we got the Gixxer 750 in 1984. And it was like, what the hell is this? It was amazing. It changed motorcycling overnight. But then, almost as quickly, people were wrecking them and destroying the fairings on them. And like, what do we do now? We've destroyed this race replica. Well, hang on a minute. Let's put straight handlebars on it and conventional headlights. Street fighters were born.
Right.
And street fighters were born in the Midlands of England in the mid-80s. And so there's this very iconic time that I inhabited. And I suppose as we get older, and I don't want to sound maudlin about it. But, as we look back, we find ourselves a particular place in our lives, and it's a very comfortable place to, memory lane is a very nice place to walk.
Right.
And we tend to look back at a time when we felt at our most comfortable, and it was very exciting and it was all very new. And I think I perhaps wanted to pay tribute a little bit to that time with my shop. If you come to my shop, it's clean, but it's not that clean. It's quite scruffy. When there's a turbo bike just kind of propped up in the corner underneath a sign that says, you won't pay more elsewhere.
Right.
So there's humor to it. But there's also a legitimacy to it. What do you know about bikes, Emma? Well, I actually know quite a lot because there's a turbo Goldwing there that I built. Oh, okay then. And that's kind of how it used to be in the old days. Modern motorcycle shops, again, there is a place for everyone, but it's quite a sterile environment. I think if you're buying your motorcycle from a guy in a suit who looks more at home behind the wheel of a Prius than holding onto the handlebars of a ZX14, perhaps it's not the greatest experience. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I feel about the current motorcycle industry. I think it needs to change. But you're going to ask me for what does meaningful change look like? What does tangible change look like? And I really don't know.
Yeah, and that does seem to be the prevailing view. I have to say, I kind of I don't have a deep investment in the past because I came back to motorcycling as a fair way into my adulthood. So sentiment is not as big a part of my experience, if you like. That said, I can get just as excited about my Triumph, which is as analog as it gets, other than having fuel injection, but also the KTM, which is a space shuttle of a motorcycle technically, and I'm thrilled about both of those things. I get less thrilled when I run into the sort of corporatized culture of this industry, if that makes sense. There's I don't want to make an unfair judgment or get controversial, but it feels like there's a bit of a threat to its soul. Does that seem like an overstatement to you?
Yeah, no, I understand exactly where you're coming from, and it comes back to the same problem of the relationship we have with our bikes, and we're faced with a problem because in order for a company to survive, it really has to have a corporate identity, whether we like it or not. A perfect example is Indian. And, Indian has had an interesting history. I mean, Indian made fantastic motorcycles. They went bankrupt in the 1950s. The name was resurrected by a gentleman called Floyd Clymer in the 1970s, but he was never really got financial backing. But if we fast forward to 1999 actually, the company was resurrected just down the road from me in Gilroy, California. Garlic Capital USA. And the problem is it was run largely by enthusiasts. And it failed. Quality control wasn't great. Corporate culture wasn't sufficient to keep this afloat. In effect, you needed more guys in suits making financial decisions because having a bunch of biker enthusiasts making these things, it was just great, but the company was unsustainable. So you have to have a foot in both camps, but it's like, which one? It's the two wolves within you. Which one do you feed?
Right.
And as bikers, we're fiercely individual. We are individuals. We hate corporate culture. We shake our fist at corporate culture because it's terrible, because it is. But unfortunately, for a company like Honda, like Suzuki, like KTM, to survive, like Triumph, they have to make tough financial decisions. They have to be run by guys in suits. They have to have value for the shareholders. I hate it. I hate every moment of it. But it's a necessary evil.
Mm.
And a car company, unless you're in really specialist cars like Aston Martins, who you're going to sell to fabulously wealthy people, or Bentleys or Rolls Royces, you're just selling appliances. So the corporate culture doesn't matter. If you're selling Toyotas, it's fine. People expect these things to be appliances.
Right.
And you go into a Toyota dealer, and it's just Toyota Corporation all the way, because that's what you expect. But we're not like that. We're bikers. We're individuals. We're romantic. We want more of an experience from our dealers. And I think that's the tightrope that manufacturers themselves and dealerships, that's going to be the conundrum that they face, is how to embrace enough of corporate culture to actually survive. Because make no mistake, it is a dog-eat-dog world out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But not so much that you take away from the human element of this deeply romantic. All bikers are romantics at heart. Every single one of us wants to ride into the sunset with our sweetheart in the back, with a Bob Seger song playing in our heads. That's the greatest thing in the world.
Right.
And sometimes life's like that. We're more likely to get that experience than a Prius driver. But the mortgage still has to be paid, you know. Triumph still have to invest millions in research and development to make your Bonneville better. KTM still needs to keep on the cutting edge of technology to keep their bikes reliable. And so you have to toe the line. It really is a conundrum. And I'm not sure whether I've got any solutions. All I try and do is make my little space of motorcycling, a kinder and more personal space.
Right.
But it's just me. I can do that. If I had 10,000 employees like Triumph do, or even 20 employees like a dealership does, I wouldn't have the same amount of freedom that I do. I mean, I can largely go into work and do what the hell I want.
Yeah.
If I want to wear a tutu and combat boots and work on your bike wearing that, I can do it because it's my shop.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of it's a great insight, because I think in a sense I'm, as a typical motorcyclist, if there is such a thing, I'm actually kind of a terrible person from the perspective of the manufacturer, because I want you to build me a reliable bike that performs at contemporary levels and will be will be affordable and competitive and do all the things that I want it to do. But don't you dare break the spell that I'm under when I'm near or on my bike. And I wonder if that's maybe the magic of working with you, is that you don't break that spell.
Well, I mean, that's very kind of you to say so. I am a hopeless romantic and always have been. And perhaps, that's what sets me apart. And I understand the love affair that riders have with their bikes. And I understand that if you leave your bike with me, it's like you're leaving your child with me, or your wife with me, or your husband with me. And it's a hugely privileged position. But I'm never happier. The big prize for me is getting the rider back on their bike.
Right.
Especially at Misfits. You know, I always joke at Misfits, you're pushing your bike down, but you're riding it home. Let's get you back on it, because that's the magic. That's the magic of motorcycling, is putting the person on the machine and propelling yourself down the road.
Yeah.
Even looking back all these years, going back 45 years, I can still remember the first time I moved a motorcycle under its own propulsion. And it changed my life.
Yeah.
Absolutely changed my life. It was magic. It was nothing short of magic.
Yep.
And it's still magic.
Yep, it still is. That's right. That is right. And you know, honestly, I kind of feel like that might be the single biggest distinction between a great mechanic or a great shop and one that is not so great. You know, I was going to ask you. We're running. I'm asking a lot of you time wise, so I'll try to compress this. But I was going to ask you a little bit about being sentimental or reverent towards old machines. You don't strike me as someone who is encumbered by that. So I know you've done some amazing restoration work, and you take care of some valuable bikes. I think you had events in the shop a little while ago, although I had the sense you were glad to see it go because it was such a valuable thing.
I wasn't. My insurance company was.
Right. Fair
There
enough.
was a short period of time when I had 2 Vincents in the shop, and my broker was calling me daily saying, "Get rid of one."
Yeah. So I sympathize. But you're the same person who built Tubbo, which is not a bike that shows any reverence for the past, which I say with nothing but affection. You don't strike me as someone who sees these things as sacred, even though you've copped to being a romantic. I wonder if you can talk a bit about, sort of contrast those pursuits, the building and the restoration and preservation. Do they scratch different itches for you, or is it the same thing?
No, it's the same. It's the same itch. I mean, without trying to sound crude, even though it is, because remember, I'm a working class oik, darling.
Yes.
Is Tubbo doesn't, stick its tongue out at convention. Tubbo drops its trousers and breaks wind in your face in convention.
It does.
And it was built that way. But no, it scratches the same itch. I do have a huge amount of reverence for bikes made in the past, because without them, there would be no present. And if we take a Vincent as an example, here's a Vincent Black Shadow, arguably one of the most valuable bikes in the world. Most Black Shadows now are going from between 150 and $250,000. Well, what is a Vincent Black Shadow? It's a 1000cc V-twin with 60 horsepower. Whoa! Feeble brakes, feeble handling, feeble everything. And yet here we are, that we hold it in such reverence in our hearts, because it's a historical piece. And so my mantra with some of the older bikes, it's always about preservation, because it's honoring the past and it's honoring the bike's history. So there's 2 histories. When a bike comes to me, I'm receiving, in a couple of weeks, I'm receiving a 1958 Triumph. And that Triumph's got 2 histories. And the first history is the history of 1958 Triumphs. And it starts in 1903 when the Triumph Company was founded. It goes all the way through, blah, 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 all these models until we come to the Triumph Speed Twin of 1953. But the second history is of that particular bike that was bought new by Joe Smith and ridden around the hills of Van Nuys, California, and then taken out into the desert and ridden out in the desert on his weekends. And he courted his girlfriend Wanda and then married her. Mm. And then they had a child, and the child grew up and so on and so forth. And that's the history of that bike. And that becomes part of its history. And I want to honor that as well. So, yeah, I like building custom bikes that defy any kind of convention. But being given an older bike, it doesn't even have to be a particularly important model of bike. But if it's got an important history within the family that owns it, or just an important history within the sphere of motorcycling, I want to honor that. And I'll try and preserve as much as possible. So, yeah. I mean, there's, like I say, there's two camps. There's send it off, get it chrome, stainless steel, custom, pink neon, blah, 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 blah. And then patina. Keep the patina.
Right.
And it depends on the bike, but it amounts to the same thing. It scratches the same itch. It's motorcycles, darling. That's all it is. Right. It's motorcycle.
Yeah. So my next question was going to be, I was going to come back at you with another forced choice question and say, if you had to pick one, would you rather restore, build, or repair? But it sounds to me like that's a dumb question that you've already answered. They're all motorcycles, and it's a ridiculous hypothetical.
No, I don't. No, I think it's a valid question, but somebody once made the mistake of asking me what band I liked. And a far more pertinent question to me is what song I like. Because, if you take any band, even some of the greatest bands in the world like Led Zeppelin, not all their songs are great. Not all the Rolling Stones songs are great. So how do we tie this in with motorcycling? I enjoy restoring some bikes. I enjoy doing complete builds on other bikes. Turbo needed building. The world needed a neon pink pearl turbo Honda Goldwing. And if you think the paint job on it is wild now, you wait till you see the 2022 incarnation. It's going to look like a Roy Lichtenstein painting.
That's fantastic.
So they're all different, but they're all the same.
Yep.
They're all such different projects, but they all occupy exactly the same place in my heart. And, I suppose I'm a restless soul. I mean, I have this fire burning inside me for motorcycling. And I'm not sure if I'm trying to extinguish it or trying to stoke it. I mean, I suppose if I ever wanted peace in my life, I'd try and extinguish it. So maybe by just messing around with bikes, I'm trying to extinguish the fire a little bit and tame it. On the other side of the coin, I might be stoking it more. I don't know. One's a very cerebral way of looking at it. The other one's a very sort of visceral, romantic way of looking at it. But yeah. I'm passionate about what I do.
Yeah, that's clear. It's funny that you should mention that conflict, because just the other day, your fellow misfit, Jim, posted something on Instagram about his struggle in the desert, and I mangled a quote from Tennessee Williams. It basically said something like, without conflict, a person, in this case a man, is but a sword cutting daisies. And I think he liked it. I think, but it reminds me of of the conflict that you just sort of shared, which is, which has to do with, are you really trying to end this, or would you be bereft if it were ended? I feel like I know the answer, but maybe that's just wishful thinking. What do you think about that? Do you feel like you might be a sword cutting daisies if you stop?
Oh God, if I can address the would you prefer to ride or wrench question, but if ever I was presented with a world without any motorcycles in it, I think that would be a little bit hard to bear.
Yeah.
There's so much a part of me, and I suppose we all struggle with our identity and who we are and how we're navigating through life, and who thinks we're great and who thinks we're complete idiots. But motorcycles have become so much a part of me. I was listening the other day. We've got a glorious local radio station here called K-Pig, and the old Neil Young and Crazy Horse song came on. Long May You Run. Right. And it really made me cry because it's so much a part of who I am. And I always like to think, if I've got a chrome heart in here.
I was gonna quote exactly that lyric with your chrome heart shining in the sun. It's a great track, and I do understand why you might connect with it. And it sort of maybe answers a question I was going to start to wrap this up with, which is that you've been around motorcycles for a long time, long enough to have turned into long enough that some people turn into judgmental old grumps. And I have met such people. And your work puts you in constant contact with the public, which is challenging sometimes. And you've chosen business ownership, yeah, which adds the additional misery of banks and governments to your life. So I have to conclude that you love this beyond reason, and so I was going to ask you that what does it give you that keeps the fire burning?
I don't know. To me, it's always been. I love motorcycles, and there's no question of that. But I love the people who ride them, and always have. And if you really want to go back to what makes me tick, some people are lucky enough to have very, very close families where you've got this very cohesive family unit, and you're always in contact with your brothers and sisters, and you have this great relationship with your mom and dad and so on and so forth. That ain't my family. And so I suppose I've always been looking for a tribe, and I found my tribe in motorcycling. And I don't care if you're just starting out and you're riding the most humble little 125, or you've been riding motorcycles for 50 years and you're riding, fuel-injected KZ 1300. I'm going to treat you with the same kindness and reverence because you're part of this. You're part of my tribe. And I think, I could so easily turn into an old grump, but that's not who I am. I like to think, and it's very, very naive, especially when we look around, the way the world is right now. But I like to think, we've evolved. We should have evolved where we at least can be kind to each other. And that's kind of like my default setting. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I can be unspeakably rude and I can be quite cruel to people, but it's never arbitrary. My default setting is kindness. I will always be polite to you. I will always be kind to you, unless you give me cause to be otherwise. And I think if you've spent your life around motorcycles and you've evolved into this sort of mean old grump who doesn't want to talk to anyone, who kind of surrounds themselves with secrets and motorcycles, you're kind of missing out a little bit. Because the people are the best part.
Yeah.
And always have been. We're such a quirky bunch.
Yep.
And it's such a great leveler. You know, it doesn't matter what demographic you're from. If you ride a motorbike, you know, I don't care whether you're a boy or a girl. I don't care whether you're gay or you're straight. I don't care whether you're rich or poor. I don't care who you voted for. None of this matters. Do you have an interest in bikes? Great. Let's be friends. No interest in bikes? Probably find somebody else to hang out with.
Right.
It's really that simple.
Yep.
So it's easy. It's easy for me. Kindness is very, very easy for me because we're in the same tribe.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I think probably 10,000 people are nodding right now because I hear that a lot, and it's what draws me to it. And from all the people that I hear from who listen to this podcast and others like Motorcycles and Misfits, it's what motivates them too. So I guess maybe asked and answered. Well, Miss Emma, with your chrome heart shining in the sun, I have enjoyed this so much. Thank you for making the time. A belated happy Thanksgiving to you, and continued success with Mototown. I love knowing you're out there.
Well, no, thank you so much. I mean, thank you for being a charming host, and for asking such poignant questions. I mean, you never know what you're going to get and what the interviewer is going to be after. But I've had such an agreeable time, and hopefully you got a little insight into what makes me tick.
Well,
and
yep, a little bit.
Motorbikes, darling.
What's that?
Motorbikes, darling.
Motorbikes.
It's as simple as that.
That's as simple as that. Honestly, I think I can keep us going for another 2 hours, to tell you the truth. But yes, I do now have a sense of what keeps you ticking, and I'm happy to report that you're everything I hoped you would be. So again, thank you, and ride safe out there and have a great weekend.
Oh, thank you, Bruce, and to all your listeners. Thanks for riding motorbikes, guys, and keep it up, because motorbikes are great. Well, you knew that already, of course.
Yep, they did. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Well, you could probably tell that I enjoyed this conversation. Still, I'll keep these comments brief because I know this was a long one, which I think kind of holds the key to my original question. You see, I went into this looking for an answer to what makes a great mechanic tick, without even considering the possibility that it might be the same thing that makes us tick. My conversation with Miss Emma very quickly went from some kind of pretense at journalism to being one of those gloriously time-bending conversations we've all had after discovering someone else who loves motorcycles as much as we do. Well, Emma may be more knowledgeable than most of us, and more interesting than some of us, but her answer to that question was forehead-slappingly obvious to all of us. Motorbikes are great. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions about the show. Thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and I'm always delighted to hear from you. You can say hi on Instagram as well, where I'm at This Moto Life, and where you can find many of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, including Miss Emma Booton. For this episode's playlist recommendation, there could only be one song. This cover of Neil Young's Long May You Run comes to us from Bozeman, Montana, and a folk duo called Story Hill. Well, I really love the way these two found the ageless country soul in a song that was first recorded by a hippie 45 years ago. Neil Young wrote it about his car, but I think it could just as easily be about a motorcycle, or about each other, or about our own chrome hearts. Check my show notes to find out more about Story Hill. Buy or stream this track wherever you like to get your music, and keep staying alive out there.
Sixty.